Thank you very much for attending this session. So I'm going to talk a little bit about threat modeling and why it matters. It's a bit of a crash course into something that's actually turned out to be very, very timely in the cybersecurity industry in the past week. And I'll explain why at the end. But a little bit about me, first of all. My name is Vivienne. I work for a large national bank, the green one, the green national one, not the green Quebec one. I've always worked in the high-tech industry. I started off as a software developer. I have a computer science degree from a few lifetimes ago. And I moved into cybersecurity about a decade ago, and holy cow, it's been a wild ride. So I've always been in tech. I always worked for tech companies up until 4 years ago when I took the role at TD. And at TD, I run the cybersecurity architecture practice. I have a team of 19 security architects who report to me, and together we design the security controls for one of the largest banks in Canada and a globally GSIB, globally significant bank, basically. There's about 20 of them in the world that are identified as if something happens to them, it has global ramifications. 2 of them are Canadian. So it's a big job, and it's a big world. And on the personal side, when I have my downtime, I live in NDG, where I'm obsessed with my dog, and I play guitar when I can, and I ride my Vespa when I can. And I'm very sad that I'm here today because I can't be on my Vespa, but that's okay. I would rather be here with you guys. Okay, why do we threat model? We threat model for a couple of very obvious reasons, and it's kind of like that one of those uncomfortable hygiene things, like flossing your teeth, that everyone knows you should do, and most people don't do, or don't do often enough, or don't do well. And then you go to the dentist and they say, why do you have all this tartar? And it's like, oh, because I didn't threat model. And the reason that we threat model, one, is because threats are instant. Systems are probed within minutes, sometimes seconds of going live. About 7 or 8 years ago, there was a security researcher who just tried putting a network device live, just put a modem live on the internet with default passwords, and within under 2 minutes had hundreds of probing attempts and tests of vulnerability. It takes seconds now with the acceleration of AI. We're in a really uncomfortable spot right now where AI is probably a little more useful to the attackers than to the defenders. I don't think it's going to be that way forever. And there are actually some very clear advantages that we have on the defense side, and I'll talk about that a bit later. But we are living in a world of instant threat. And at the end of the day, what does a security breach mean? When the dust has settled and the smoke has cleared, a security breach means that you have a flaw in your design. You had a vulnerability, right? Maybe it wasn't your fault. Maybe it was a 0-day that you inherited from a vendor and nobody knew about this vulnerability until the bad guys decided to exploit it. But a security breach means that you had a flaw somewhere, either in your security architecture or maybe in your application design or in your infrastructure, but somewhere you had a flaw. And when we talk about design, security is really your architecture plus the assumptions you have about your environment. So if this starts to feel uncomfortable, it should, right? Because we're living in an increasingly non-deterministic world. And those of you who are coders, how many of you who are developers are worried about AI threatening your job or your prospects? Fair. It's fair. Everyone's worried about it. I think that what's going to be really interesting in the software engineering industry is that software engineering is going to be much less about the cranking out of code and much more about the actual engineering part of it. It's going to be about requirements. It's going to be about architecture. It's going to be about layered defense. And it's going to be about designing good architectures and being able to test them and understanding how to test them. You won't be writing test cases. AI will write and run the test cases, but you have to tell it what you're testing, right? You have to link that back to the requirements. It's going to come back to managing the complexity, which is going to remain, I strongly believe, a human task. And I'm also kind of hoping that by the time that's no longer a human task, I will be done and I will be selling pineapples in Hawaii. And then finally, there's Claude Mythos, the latest announcement from Anthropic, which means that now the AI is coming for all of us. So fantastic. It's been a fun week. I'll talk about Mythos at the end. Let's talk a little bit about threat models, though. Me having too much fun with Excalibur. This is basic web application architecture, right? It's simple by design, but essentially every web application looks like this at a certain level of abstraction, right? It's pretty simple. We all understand that pretty well now. But when you take a threat model view of it, the threat model is about taking your architecture, and you start with, data flow or architecture or something, some representation of your system, and then you figure out how are you going to attack it. So if I have a web application, like whatever it is, if it's like finding a dog sitter or selling pineapples or a social app or making restaurant reservations, like whatever your web app is, what are your assets? What are the bad guys trying to get? They're trying to get your data, right? They're trying to get user data. If you store payment information, they're after that. But most people, like unless you're a large enterprise, you probably don't have that. You're probably outsourcing that to third party, but maybe they're trying to get to the third party through you, right? Supply chain attacks. What else are they trying to do? They're trying to ransomware you, right? They're trying to create a denial of service attack, and hopefully you'll roll over and pay the Bitcoin. Fun fact, I had recently started working in security when WannaCry hit. I don't know if you guys remember WannaCry. And I had a colleague in Ontario who went to go buy paint at his neighborhood paint store. Little paint store in Aurora, Ontario. 3 employees, 1 computer in the entire place, like little old manual cash register even, right? 1 computer that's used for 1 task, and that is mixing the paint. You punch in the code, you put the can there, it squirts the dyes in, mixes it, there you go. Well, guess what? That 1 computer got WannaCryed. So my colleague goes to buy paint, and the guy's like, I can sell you anything, but I cannot mix paint because I got something that's making my computer cry, and I need my nephew to come in from the city when he's done work and tell me who I have to pay to unlock this. So you can never make the mistake that you're too small or too insignificant for the bad guys to catch, because again, with the AI and all the automation, you don't even need scripting skills anymore to launch a massive ransomware as service attack. All you really need is access to the dark web and a credit card. If I was a terrible vindictive person, for about $300 on the dark web, I could make an ex-boyfriend's life really miserable. But, fortunately for everyone, I'm over it and it's fine. But it's that easy now, and it can be done at scale by anybody. And I don't know if you guys have heard about this, but like one of the new forms of human slavery is people who are forced to work in internet scam centers. So the romance scams, the tech support scams, at the other end of it, there is a very high chance that the person who's doing that is forced labor, who were promised a high-tech job and lured away from their village in Myanmar or India or wherever, and are forced to work in this call center. And this is the new face of human slavery now. But so threat modeling, I digress. All right, there are disciplined ways of doing this, and I'm going to talk a little bit about the STRIDE framework. It's the most well-known threat modeling framework. It's a great place to start. If you're not familiar with threat modeling, it's a great place to start. There are other frameworks out there. So for example, if you're at a large enterprise, and you have a lot of security nerds, they might talk about Maestro, and there's one actually called Pasta, which is fantastic because pasta's delicious. It's a good framework because it's very risk focused. But for someone getting started, if you understand architecture and software architecture, the STRIDE framework is a great place to start. And the STRIDE framework basically says, okay, there's 6 basic kinds of attacks, right, that people come in. So the first is spoofing, where they're trying to be someone or something else. This is like fake credentials or stolen credentials. This is the classic example of a spoofing attack. There's tampering, where you're trying to modify the data or the code. There's repudiation, where they try to deny an action without any proof of why that should be done, or any proof back to the user that this action was denied. It's basically like massively disrupting your business logic in some way. There's the information disclosure, which is, that's the kind of one of the big things they're going after. There's denial of service, right, where they want to disrupt the service so that your users can't access it. And then there's the escalation of privilege, where an attacker gets access to a system and finds a way to give themselves more access than they had before, or more access than the normal user whose credentials they stole. And the interesting thing about cybersecurity and cyber threat is that Almost every single cyber attack that has ever happened in the history of ever has involved privilege escalation at some point. It is one of the most common steps in the kill chain, and yet it continues to happen because it's really, really hard to manage at scale, and it's really hard to manage in any kind of cloud or as a service environment where, if you look at your cloud shared responsibility model, you just don't have control over a lot of those things. But getting back to our application, where do we start? You start with some representation of your architecture. It can be a data flow diagram, it can be architecture, it can be whatever. And you basically walk through each of your elements and you work down the stride list. It's very logical and very methodical. You say, can this happen here, right? With my user, can the user's credentials be spoofed? Heck yeah, they can be spoofed. On the web app, can the tokens to call the services be spoofed? Yes, they can. Can the API commands, telling my application to do things, can those be spoofed? Absolutely, they can. Can data be extracted from my database if they get there? Of course they can. So you walk through everything and ask, can this happen here? And you document it. Then you figure out where you can put in countermeasures. So if I find out that, if they can inject spoofed API calls, there's a way to escalate privilege. Okay, how do I stop that from happening, right? Maybe I add in additional authentication controls around my API. Maybe I need an API gateway. There's no API gateway here. This is very bad architecture. And then you prioritize what you can actually secure. And again, if you're an entrepreneur, which I think some of the people here are, you're not running all of this infra, right? You've got partners for this. You're running an AWS or something, right? You have maybe a third-party payment service you're connecting to, or your storage, your blob storage is hosted somewhere else. You don't have access to that. But what can you control? And then you prioritize what you can actually secure. So if we think about the assets and the different entry points, right, thinking back to our architecture, what are the assets that we have to protect? Obviously, the credentials, right? We want MFA. We want passkeys. If you're more sophisticated, we want conditional access, where maybe the user looks fine, but now they're logging in from a geographic location they never has before. Maybe we'll ask for some step-up authentication. We have tokens. Tokens can be stolen. Tokens can be faked. There's a whole class of really scary info stealer malware that takes tokens right out of your browser, and woe betide anybody who's using long-lived tokens, because those are going to end up being abused somewhere else. There's the personally identifiable information. I never say that out loud, the whole thing. There's the PII, which is a big problem, because if you're responsible for a leak of PII, that's a regulatory thing. That's a privacy breach now. And then a whole world of legal and privacy pain kicks in. There's your API keys. I cannot tell you. So before I was at TD, I worked at IBM, and I was a security architect at IBM. And I cannot tell you how many customers I talked to. And we're not talking like, 3-person paint stores in Aurora, Ontario. We're talking like, the kind of people who can afford IBM services. You can't believe the number of people I would talk to and be like, why are you storing keys in code? Why do you have these API keys on developer desktops? Because you have just turned every developer endpoint into a secrets vault. Congratulations. It's a real problem. And now, with microservices architecture and the proliferation of cloud and everything else that we're layering in, everything is API calls, everything has keys, everything has SSH certificates, and everything needs to be protected and encrypted and rotated and vaulted, and that it's a huge nightmare. But this is also very, very fundamental security hygiene. There's nothing particularly novel there. It's just all that stuff that we've always known that we should do, that we don't always. There's our admin access, and then there's all the different ways that people get at it. It drives me crazy when people talk about DevSecOps, because I think it's a lie. And I think it's something that people tell themselves to feel good, because management of the developer environment is always one of the weakest points in almost any organization. And I get it. I get it. We don't want to create friction for our developers. It's incredibly expensive, it's incredibly annoying and frustrating, and it tangibly slows the business down. But it's also a huge vulnerability for everybody. And that's why, like, when I talk about, application security, I always kind of talk about people right along with it, because like water always flows to the lowest point. People will always try to find the easiest way to get their work done, and you can't blame them, but people remain one of your strongest entry points for an attacker. And I'm not even going to get into the social engineering aspect of it, because that's another talk, but people remain one of the scariest entry points. So if we get back to our application, you can identify certain trust boundaries, right? And a trust boundary is when you're moving from one place to another in your architecture, and you would want to verify that this is still a trusted interaction. So your user is out there accessing your application over the public internet, and then the application itself is making API calls, right, to go back to your app server, your database, your object storage, what have you. So that's your application layer, right? Within the application layer, there's certain things that you can probably trust a little bit more than things that are outside of it, but that's a trust boundary that you need to think about where you can introduce compensatory controls. You have your cloud management planning, and this is a very, very simple architecture, but your cloud management plane is also a huge trust boundary, and it's also a huge boundary in the shared responsibility model, because this is where things start to get a little murkier about what you actually have control over and where you are responsible for things. Quick question, see if anybody knows this. Suppose that this is my AWS application. I've built it entirely on AWS. Who's responsible for my data? Is it Amazon? No. You are always responsible for the data. It doesn't matter. And this is why unsecured containers always gets everyone in the end. It's terrible. Happens all the time. Another trust boundary that you want to be really careful of is wherever you have third-party services, because on the other side of this boundary, you have no control, right? It's one thing for me to have this contract with Amazon. If I'm going out to another third party, like payment services, that's a totally different shared responsibility model. That's a totally different SLA, and if that's also a place where I might become part of a supply chain attack, where maybe someone's trying to get to interact through me, for example. So you think about your trust boundaries, and then you figure out at each point along the way, what are the typical threats that we would see? So, on the user side, we've got our classic MFA fatigue, right? And that's where the bad guy just finds a way to spam the user with a billion MFA alerts, hoping at some point they get sick of it and just say, yeah, okay, fine, right? It happens. It's a very, very real thing. Everybody's worried about it. And it can be automated really easy right now. There's the phishing attacks, there's the stolen credentials. At the application layer, we worry about things like cross-site scripting, poisoned cookies, browser-based attacks, and good old-fashioned brute force. Good old-fashioned brute force has gotten easier for the bad guys now with all the automation that AI gives them. We still worry a lot about SQL injection, which drives me mental, because there's some basic sanitization that you should be able to just bake in that would take care of a lot of it, and yet people don't stay current with it. And then this is a really scary one, server-side request forgery. This one's really hard, because this is basically around abusing API calls to send what looks like a legitimate API request. And you've got the right credentials, and you've got the right format, and everything looks correct. But then it comes back and basically forces your server on the other side, whether it's your PHP server or your database or whatever, to just spit out all its data. It's a very, very real thing. It's very, very difficult to detect in action. And the only way that you can really do it is that if you're monitoring your east-west API traffic, like your internal API calls. Usually we monitor up to the front door. And then once they're in the organization or within like that trust boundary, we trust it, and we shouldn't. It's very hard to detect. And then, of course, as I said before, we get down to the third party and we have no control here, but what can we do? We can plan for breach, right? We can have a good incident response playbook. We can have good lawyers on call, I suppose. That's never a bad idea. But, you know, this is a very caveman view of, you know, what you would capture in a threat model. And then we would go through and then we would figure out, okay, what are the controls and the mitigations? So on the data side, do we have the right level of encryption for the type of data we're handling? Do we have the right privacy controls? Is everything auditable so that we know who's accessing the data, when, where, why, yada, yada? There's basic application security and monitoring of the software supply chain, like understand who all the different players are, and if one of the third parties or if my cloud provider gets breached, what can I configure to defend against that? There's, you know, authorization and authentication are still the top two threats in application security. Who here has heard of OWASP? Yes, the Open Web Application Security Project. Auth-N and Auth-Z have been in the OWASP top 10 forever. Like maybe there was 1 year that they weren't number one and number two, but it's a huge problem. And with all of the AI applications that people are developing, like I'm not even talking about the bad AI. Let's talk about the good AI. That's all non-human identities. That's all API calls. All the agentic stuff, that's all non-human identities that should ideally be governed and monitored and managed and their credentials vaulted and everything else. We don't do it with our sysadmins. How well are we going to do it with, you know, all these agentic identities that come and go? You know, we don't know how fast they're proliferating. I was going to do a little exercise where I kind of like walked through a whole catalog of controls and said, congratulations, guys, you only have money to choose 3. But that gets really depressing, but it's also very realistic. At the end of the day, when it comes down to looking at your controls and mitigations, you have to think about what do I have control over, what can I afford, and what I'm going to prioritize, right? I'm going to invest. If it's up to me, I'm going to invest in data security because unsecured containers gets everybody. Like most of the data breaches that you hear about where people are hosted on big cloud service providers, it's because of unsecured containers or default credentials. Unmanaged developer access basically gives the attackers the key to the kingdom. So I'm going to put some basic controls there. I'm going to look at MFA. I'm going to look at Auth-N and Auth-Z for sure. And then after that, I don't know. I don't know how much money I have left after that. This is an example, and I kind of took the picture from the OWASP top 10 and recreated it, like simplified it a little bit for the purpose of this discussion. The OWASP project is really great. In 2025, they updated the top 10 application security threats, and they created their own version specific to LLM. They have one for agentic AI as well. And the number one threat for LLMs is prompt injection, because this is how, I mean, that's the front door. That's how they jailbreak it. That's how they take your happy little, I don't know, fashion recommendation app and make it go full racist uncle, is with a jailbreak attack, right? It's funny, but I've seen it happen. You know, prompt injection can happen in multiple places. It can happen at the front end, literally with the front actor at the front end of your application. It can happen in between your apps and the gateway. They can try and inject those jailbreak prompts right into your API gateway. It can happen between any of your third parties. And if they get inside, it can also happen, it can happen anywhere, almost anywhere here, by the way. I just kind of showed the main places. Data disclosure and leaky data can happen almost anywhere along here. If you know, they can get the orchestrator to spit out things, if they can get your models to give up information about how they were trained or where the data set came from, that can be really, really dangerous as well. What are some of the things I want to point out? Now, everyone talks a lot about data and model poisoning, which if it actually happens is really, really bad because it's hard to trace back the provenance of it. So far, we haven't seen a lot of that happen in the wild. And I think it's because, and this is where I talk a little bit about the advantage that defenders have, I think it's because it's actually more difficult for attackers to compromise a data set or a model supply chain than it is to just make your chatbot go racist uncle, right? That's a lot easier for them to do. We kind of joke in the industry about, oh, the bad guys only have to get it once, but we have to get it right every time 24/7. And that's kind of true. But it also means that we have an advantage because we know our environment. The bad guys can use generic information and generic attacks. We have the advantage of specificity, right? So if we take control of our security posture and we take control of our architecture and we complement it with up-to-date threat models, then we can introduce that kind of resilience. Then we can look at that kind of end-to-end resiliency where, for example, once an attacker gets in, they're going to go wherever they can easily. So let's force them into a part of our environment that's bristling with sensors, right? Instead of giving them an easy path to the data. So those are the kinds of advantages that we as humans have on the defense side. And I think that's super important now in light of Mythos and Project Glasswing. So for those of you who may not have heard the news, last week Anthropic announced Claude Mythos, which they're not releasing to the public because it's terrifying and is basically a version of Claude that they trained on cybersecurity. Yay! And Mythos went out and found thousands of previously undiscovered vulnerabilities in every major operating system and browser. Some of these are stable systems that have been in production for decades, have literally gone through hundreds of code reviews, and nobody found these vulnerabilities. That's really scary. That's like hundreds of 0 days just waiting to happen. For me, what's really scary about that is also the fact that Mythos is able to chain together a series of minor vulnerabilities and medium grade ones and turn them collectively into one big one. And not only does it do that, it also says, oh, and here's the exploit code to do it. So this thing is terrifying. In response to that, Anthropic came out, and I'm kind of glad that it's Anthropic who did this first and not, say, a less ethical company. I mean, I think all the big tech companies are very self-interested. That's a whole other talk. And anyone who was in the main stage before lunch heard this whole thing already from people far more knowledgeable than I. But I'm kind of glad it was Anthropic and not somebody else, because they did come out and they said, okay, we're starting up this thing called Project Glasswing, and it's like us getting together with the major tech companies, all the usual suspects are at the table. But it's really about them understanding, okay, what are we going to do to defend against this? So if I'm a Microsoft or a Google or a CrowdStrike, how am I baking this capability into my tools to help my customers in the world defend themselves? Of course, this is just the proof of the capability. You can do that kind of vulnerability detection with models smaller and cheaper than Claude. If you're not interested in actually generating the exploit code, but you just want to find the vulnerabilities, if you're not interested in the chaining as much, it's really not that hard now. But I think this means that in the next 30, 60, 90 days, we're going to see a lot of attacks happening. And it's pretty scary. But then what does this mean to cyber defenders? Well, it means we need to patch faster. Okay, we knew that already, right? It means we need to tighten up our incident response. Okay, we knew that already too. It means that we have to take control of our tech debt, which makes me laugh a bit because technical debt is something that we always get away with until we can't get away with it anymore. And surprise, that day is here. And it means all of the good hygiene that we had, we always knew we had to do, now we have to do at scale and with speed. So there's a saying I guess it goes around in IT circles, never let a good crisis go to waste. If you've been pushing for mobile passkeys, hey, it's a good idea. Let's do that fast now. All of your vulnerability management people, guess what? They have a really important seat at the table right now. And a threat model goes a long way to calling out where these things are and knowing exactly where to direct your efforts. You don't have to go very far or look very deep to find stories about breaches where people had, oh, we forgot to apply this patch. Oh, we didn't update this certificate. If you have up-to-date architectures, if you have a good threat modeling program, you know where these things live. And there's lots of, if you're a small organization or, just a startup or, a one-person entrepreneur, do your threat modeling on paper. That's fine. But if you're any size organization that has an IT and a security budget, there are threat modeling tools out there. There are LLM-backed tools that will generate your threat models for you. There are tools that will take your threat models and will help you turn them into detection rules that you can leverage at your SIM, right? And within your threat monitoring that can put together, that help you prioritize the vulnerabilities that you need to address. So that capability is there, but it's kind of like flossing, and everyone kind of does it half-heartedly and inconsistently. So my feelings about this talk were very different a week and a half ago, because I'd had this idea of doing a whole whiteboard exercise, but I thought it was more important to talk a little bit about vulnerability management and mythos and the significance of just doing this at all. That's it.